The winter of 1944 was a monster. Belgium was drowning in snow and silence, a silence shattered every few minutes by the sound of distant guns. Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, was ripping into the Allied lines like a steel claw. Entire battalions vanished overnight. Towns were swallowed by smoke and flame. In that frozen chaos there was one bridge, a narrow crossing in the fog, where history decided to stop and stare. Because standing on that bridge, all alone, was a 19-year-old American farm kid with a Browning automatic rifle in his hands and nothing behind him but the United States Army. His name was Francis S. Currey, though the men who survived that day would simply call him Frank the Tank Killer. At dawn on December 21st, 1944, the woods near the Belgian town of Malmedy trembled under the roar of German artillery. Shells screamed overhead, their explosions turning snow into vapor, trees into splinters and men into ghosts. The 3rd Battalion of the 120th Infantry was holding the line, barely, its right flank anchored by that narrow bridge. If the Germans broke through there, the entire position would collapse. From the grey smoke came the unmistakable growl of engines, panzers. The iron beasts of Kampfgruppe paper, the Waffen-SS unit that had already left a trail of massacres in its wake, were rolling west again. Only days earlier, these same men had executed 84 unarmed American prisoners near Malmedy. Survivors told of laughter as the SS strolled among the bodies, finishing the wounded. It was the kind of horror that hardened men overnight, and Francis Currey had heard the stories. He knew that surrender was suicide. When the bombardment lifted, Currey pressed his face into the frozen dirt, heart hammering as tank treads crushed the snow somewhere ahead. Through the drifting haze, the lead panzer appeared, its armor glistening with frost, its black cross barely visible under a coat of soot and grime. A German commander rose from the turret, scanning the bridge with binoculars, confident that no one was left alive to resist. He was wrong. Currey steadied his BR, exhaled once, and squeezed the trigger. The commander's body dropped back into the turret like a sack of stones. The column hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Currey sprang to his feet and ran through a storm of bullets toward a nearby barn where he knew heavier weapons were stored. Glass shattered around him as he dove through a window, rolled, and came up with a bazooka clutched in his hands. Without thinking, he slammed a rocket into the tube, shouldered it, and fired. The warhead hit the seam between the hull and turret, fusing the metal like molten clay. The tank screeched, halted, and belched smoke, the crew trapped inside their own steel coffin. That should have been the end of it. But for Currey, it was only the beginning. Outside, more panzers crawled forward, their tracks grinding over the dead and the debris. SS infantry fanned out, black uniforms cutting through the snow. The rest of Currey's unit had fallen back toward a factory for cover, leaving him practically alone on the line. Yet, in that isolation, something inside him hardened. The farm boy from upstate New York, the orphan who'd grown up fixing fences and feeding livestock, was gone. In his place stood a soldier who had decided that if the SS wanted that bridge, they would have to drive over his body to take it. He grabbed another rocket, dashed back into the open, and fired again. The 2nd Panzer jolted to a stop, its turret blown sideways, smoke pouring from its hatches. The air filled with the metallic shriek of ricochets, the smell of cordite and burning fuel. Still, he kept moving. From building to building, from weapon to weapon. He fought like a man possessed, switching between his BAR, his bazooka, and a half-trax .50 caliber machine gun, cutting down squads of SS infantry and blasting tanks until they smoldered like torches in the snow. And through it all, the sound of his own breath in the cold, steady, mechanical, almost calm, was the only thing reminding him he was still alive. Within an hour, the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's most feared armored spearhead, had ground to a halt. Their commanders believed they'd stumbled into a heavily fortified American position. In truth, they'd been stopped by a single 19-year-old with ice in his veins and a will that refused to break. As the sun climbed over the horizon, the snow around that bridge was littered with burnt steel, twisted treads, and the blackened remains of the men who had thought themselves invincible. And in the middle of it stood Frank Currey, rifle smoking, uniform torn, frost clinging to his eyelashes, one man against the armored fist of the Third Reich. The morning deepened into a pale grey blur of smoke and snow, a colourless world where sound travelled strangely and time seemed to crawl. The burning wrecks of German armour hissed in the cold as their ammunition cooked off, small explosions crackling like angry fireworks. Frank Currey's uniform was soaked with sweat beneath layers of frost, his gloves stiff with ice, but his movements remained deliberate, disciplined, the kind of rhythm only fear and training could forge together. Across the road, an SS squad was regrouping near a half-collapsed farmhouse, shouting orders in sharp German bursts. They believed they were closing in on a trapped American unit, unaware that they were fighting against a single man. Currey leaned out from a shattered window, leveled his BR and unleashed a burst so precise it tore through the lead soldier and sent the rest scattering. He ducked back just as a Panzer's coaxial machine gun opened fire, bullets hammering the stone wall and spraying dust across his face. Inside the building, the air was thick with smoke and the stench of oil. He looked down, his last bazooka rocket lay at his feet. He knew he'd need it. Outside, the rumble of treads drew closer again. Another tank was forcing its way down the narrow road, its turret scanning, its barrel swinging left and right like a beast searching for prey. Currey steadied himself, waited until the tank angled slightly, exposing its flank, and then fired. The explosion tore through the quiet like thunder in a canyon. The Panzer lurched, flames gushing from its side as the crew scrambled to escape, but the cold had frozen everything. The hatches, their fingers, even their courage. When the fire reached the ammunition rack, the entire tank vanished in a rolling ball of orange light that briefly illuminated the dead. Currey didn't celebrate. He didn't even breathe. He simply reloaded his BAR, checked his corners, and moved again. The Germans were adapting. He could hear them shifting to his flanks, trying to envelop him in crossfire. He ducked behind a truck riddled with holes, and spotted, to his disbelief, 5 American soldiers lying pinned behind a wall 50 yards away. 2 were bleeding heavily, and every attempt to move was met by bursts of automatic fire from an SS-held house up the street. He knew what that meant. No rescue, no reinforcements. Those men would die where they lay, unless someone did something impossible. Currey did not hesitate. He sprinted across the open street, bullets snapping past his ears like hornets. He slid behind a frozen jeep, tore open an ammunition box and filled his arms with grenades. Then he ran again, weaving through the smoke and snow, each step a gamble against death. As he reached the corner, he yanked the pins one by one and hurled the grenades toward the enemy position. The detonations ripped through the air, shredding walls, windows, and men alike. Then came the moment that would make him legend. Climbing onto an abandoned half-track, he swung the dead gunner's .50 caliber machine gun toward the enemy house and opened fire. The weapon's recoil slammed into his shoulder, the muzzle flash bathing his face in orange light as tracers tore through the walls. Brick, wood, and bone disintegrated under the storm of lead. The SS fire ceased, replaced only by the distant groan of burning armor and the whisper of falling snow. "Move!" he shouted, waving the pinned Americans toward him. They crawled, limping and staggering through the smoke, 2 men supporting a third, dragging another. Currey held the trigger until the belt ran dry, the barrels glowing red, covering their retreat until every last one had crossed back to safety. When the final wounded man collapsed beside him, Frank Currey dropped from the half-track, chest heaving, hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. Around him, the battlefield was silent, an eerie, terrible silence, broken only by the sound of his own breath. In less than 2 hours, he had destroyed or disabled multiple tanks, wiped out entire squads of SS infantry, rescued 5 comrades, and forced the most feared armored unit of the Waffen-SS to retreat in confusion. His commanding officers would later swear that the Germans believed they had run into an entire regiment of American defenders. In reality, they had run into one. As the smoke lifted, he looked back toward the bridge. It still stood, miraculously intact, its wooden planks dusted with snow and ash. The 120th Infantry's right flank was secure. The 3rd Battalion was still alive. And for the first time in days, the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Division had been stopped cold. That night, as the survivors huddled in the remains of a farmhouse, someone brought Currey a tin mug of coffee. He sat in silence, steam rising around his bruised face, eyes still fixed on the dark tree line where the enemy had vanished. When asked how he'd done it, how he'd faced an entire German column alone, he shrugged and said quietly, "Somebody had to hold the bridge." He didn't say it for glory. He said it because it was true. When dawn broke over the Belgian countryside the following day, the battlefield was frozen still, a graveyard of steel and silence. Smoke curled from the blackened carcasses of German armor, and the once pristine snow had turned the color of rust. Scouts from the 120th Infantry fanned out cautiously, half expecting the SS to counterattack. But the panzers were gone, retreating west in confusion, leaving behind wrecks, wounded, and the bodies of their fallen. The bridge still stood, lonely and defiant, guarded by the faint boot prints of the 19-year-old who had refused to run. Word spread fast. By midday, officers were visiting the site, tracing the path Currey had taken from the factory window to the blasted half-track, from the cratered road to the burned-out tanks. Everywhere they looked was evidence of one man's willpower made visible: twisted armor, shattered stone, empty bazooka tubes still warm from use. The commander of his battalion simply shook his head and said, "One man did all this." No one answered, because the truth sounded impossible. In the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, stories like that rarely survived beyond rumor, but this one did. Within days, written reports described how a single private had destroyed or disabled multiple tanks, killed or wounded numerous enemy soldiers, and rescued 5 pinned-down Americans, all under continuous fire. Those who had witnessed the aftermath were unanimous: if that bridge had fallen, the 3rd Battalion would have been encircled, perhaps annihilated. For Francis S. Currey, it was just another day survived. When asked about it years later, he recalled how fear never truly left him, how every shell that landed felt like it was meant for him personally, how every second he expected a bullet to find his head. But he kept moving, not because he thought he was invincible, but because stopping meant dying. "I just did what I had to do," he would later say, his voice quiet and steady, "and I was lucky enough to live through it." General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, reportedly remarked that Currey's actions had shortened the war by 6 weeks or more. Whether that number was symbolic or calculated didn't matter, the sentiment did. A 19-year-old orphan from a small town in upstate New York had, through sheer courage and precision, halted the advance of Hitler's most feared SS spearhead. In the months that followed, as the snow melted and the Ardennes returned to mud and ruin, Currey continued to fight. He was wounded in Bavaria while disarming a group of German soldiers who refused to surrender. He refused evacuation. By the end of the war, he had earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts, and a reputation among his comrades that could not be written on any citation, that of a man who never hesitated when the line was about to break. On July 27, 1945, under the hot sun of occupied France, Major General Leland Hobbs stood before the assembled ranks of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. In front of the men, with medals gleaming and boots polished, stood the same boy who had once sprinted through artillery fire in a snowstorm. When his name was called, Technical Sergeant Francis S. Currey, a cheer erupted across the field. As the Medal of Honor was pinned to his chest, Currey didn't smile. His eyes were downcast, his posture straight but modest, like a man being thanked for something he still didn't fully believe he had done. He would later admit he never wore the medal in public again. "It wasn't sept just me," he said. "It was the guys who didn't sept make it." Back home in New York, he returned to a quiet life. He worked in the post office, served in the National Guard, raised a family. The world moved on. Korea, Vietnam, new wars and new heroes. But for those who remembered the frozen nightmare of 1944, the name Currey still meant something rare: unshakable resolve under the blackest sky of war. In his later years, when journalists or students asked him about that morning in Belgium, he would look away for a moment, his expression unreadable, then say softly, "I was just a kid." But history tells it differently. History says that on December 21, 1944, a single 19-year-old American stood between Hitler's best killers and the destruction of an entire battalion. History says he faced tanks, grenadiers, and machine guns with nothing but courage, instinct, and a borrowed bazooka. And history says that when the smoke cleared, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the same division that had massacred Americans at Malmedy, turned back in defeat, humiliated by a farm kid who refused to die. There were no trumpets that day, no music, no grand speeches, just a bridge, a blizzard, and one soldier who decided that freedom was worth the risk of everything. And maybe that's why his story matters, because wars are not won by numbers alone, but by moments like that, when a single human being stands unyielding against the tide of history and says, in silence, "Not today." In the days that followed, the Ardennes froze into legend. The Battle of the Bulge was raging across a front that stretched 100 miles from north to south, a jagged scar across Belgium and Luxembourg. Towns were traded, lost, retaken, burned to the ground, then defended again by men who hadn't slept in days. The Germans called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, but the Americans simply called it the Bulge because that was what it looked like on the map, a great swelling of enemy armor pushing deep into their lines. And right at the northern shoulder of that bulge, where the forests were thick and the roads narrow, the men of the 30th Infantry Division were still holding firm. The snow never stopped falling. The air reeked of smoke and cordite, a mix that clung to the back of the throat and burned the lungs. For many soldiers, the memory of what Francis Currey had done spread like wildfire, told in foxholes and mess tents in half-whispered tones. The kid who stopped the SS by himself. In a war that had already consumed millions of lives, such stories mattered. They were proof that courage could still bend steel. The 1st SS Panzer Division under Colonel Joachim Paper never fully recovered from the blow. Their vehicles were running out of fuel. American air power was back in the sky now that the weather had cleared. The same icy roads that had carried their assault now became traps, bottlenecked by wrecks and burning convoys. Paper's once proud column, the same that had committed the Malmedy massacre, would soon be forced to abandon its tanks and flee on foot through the woods, hunted like animals. When Allied troops later found the abandoned vehicles, some still smoldered, frozen corpses inside, engines fused solid by the cold. And there, among the captured documents, Allied intelligence discovered something strange. Hastily scribbled German reports describing heavy resistance from large American force near bridge east of Stavelot. The irony was staggering. The large force they spoke of had been one man. For Currey, there was no celebration, no time to reflect. The front was fluid, chaotic. He moved on with his unit, pushing back the enemy yard by yard, village by village, through snow and mud and smoke. At night, he'd clean his weapon by candlelight, his hands cracked and raw, the tiny flame flickering against the frost-covered walls of barns and basements that had become their shelters. Sometimes, in those brief hours before dawn, he would think of the faces of the men he had pulled from the snow that morning at the bridge. He remembered the look in their eyes, shock, disbelief, gratitude, and exhaustion all at once. In war, friendship wasn't built over time, it was forged in seconds, in the kind of terror that made every heartbeat count. The medal, when it came, felt almost irrelevant. His citation would read like something from a movie, destroying tanks, rescuing comrades, driving back an SS battalion. But for Currey, the memory was quieter, more human. He often said later in life that he never wanted to be called a hero. He believed that heroes were the ones who didn't come home. And yet, the numbers told their own story. 5 men saved, 3 panzers destroyed, countless German infantry killed or scattered, a bridge that held, a flank that survived, a division that lived to fight another day. In the bitter calculus of war, that kind of victory was monumental. Historians later analyzed the tactical impact of that single stand. The bridge Currey defended had been a supply artery for the 30th Division's right wing. Had it fallen, the SS could have poured through, enveloping the line from behind and collapsing the northern defense. The ensuing breakthrough might have allowed Piper's armored spearhead to reach the Meuse River days earlier, a move that could have prolonged the war deep into 1945. Instead, the line held, and in the grand chain of cause and effect, one 19-year-old orphan from upstate New York had helped crush Hitler's final dream of victory. By the time the winter campaign ended in January, the Ardennes were a graveyard, more than 80,000 American casualties, nearly 100,000 German villages lay in ruins, forests were stripped bare. Yet amid that devastation, There were stories whispered in the ranks, stories of ordinary men who had done extraordinary things. Currey's name was among them. When he returned home, there were no parades, no film crews, no headlines. He was quiet, almost shy, his eyes still carrying the weight of what he'd seen. He spent the rest of his life in service, not in uniform but in small ways that mattered, helping veterans file their benefits, attending memorials, comforting families of those who hadn't made it back. He rarely talked about that day at the bridge. When pressed, he would smile faintly and say, "I just didn't want them to get across." But the truth was larger than that, larger than the man himself. In every war there are battles fought that never make the history books, lonely crossroads, nameless bridges, forgotten clearings in the woods. And in those places sometimes the tide of history turns, not because of strategy or numbers, but because one soldier refused to step aside. Francis S. Currey was one of those soldiers. Decades later, the forests of the Ardennes grew back. The craters filled with rainwater, the rusting hulks of tanks were hauled away, and the frozen roads that once carried death became quiet country lanes again, bordered by moss and birch trees. Villagers planted crops where machine gun nests had once stood, and children played on the same bridges where men had fought and bled to keep the world from falling into darkness. In 2019, the man who had once been that 19-year-old kid stood before a small memorial in New York State. His hair white, his voice thin, but his bearing still unmistakably that of a soldier. Francis S. Currey didn't wear his Medal of Honor. It lay in a case somewhere safe. He didn't need to. Every scar on his hands told the same story. Reporters asked him what he remembered most. He didn't mention the explosions or the fear or even the moment he destroyed his first tank. He said softly, "It was cold. So cold. And all I could think was that if I left my post, the others would die." That was it. No bravado. No grand narrative, just the simplicity of duty. He died that year, at 94, one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. His funeral was quiet. A handful of veterans stood in the rain as taps echoed across the hills, and a folded flag was pressed into his family's hands. The world barely noticed, but somewhere in the forests of Belgium beneath the winter soil, the ghosts of that December morning surely stirred. Because what Francis Currey did on that frozen bridge wasn't just an act of courage, it was a distillation of everything the Allied armies fought for. The belief that freedom was worth defending even when the odds were hopeless, that honor still mattered in a world gone mad. For military historians, the details remain staggering. The precision of his fire, the sequence of his movements, the way he used terrain and timing against superior numbers, it all reads like a field manual written in blood and instinct. But beyond the tactics and citations, there was something more enduring, the reminder that character, not age, defines heroism. He had been an orphan, a boy who had lost his parents before he understood what death truly meant, who had learned to stand alone long before the army taught him how to march. Perhaps that's why, when the time came, he didn't flinch. He had already spent a lifetime learning how not to run. Today, few remember the name Francis S. Currey. The textbooks devote a single line to him, if that. But among those who study the Ardennes, his legend lingers, told in veterans' halls, etched into plaques, and sometimes quietly at reunions of old soldiers who still recall that winter of fire and ice. They say that when the SS came for Malmedy, they brought with them the arrogance of killers who believed no one could stop them, and when they met Currey at that bridge, they learned they were wrong. The landscape of the modern world, every free city, every quiet dawn without sirens, is built on the shoulders of people like him, people who never asked for glory, who never saw themselves as heroes, but who stood anyway. And so, when you look at the black and white photographs from that winter, the endless columns of tanks, the snow swirling through ruined villages, the faces of men staring into the fog, remember that somewhere among them stood a kid from New York with frost on his helmet and a steady aim, waiting for the enemy to appear. He didn't know he was making history. He only knew that a bridge had to be held. And in that knowledge, in that lonely act of defiance, the course of the war tilted ever so slightly toward freedom.